let's go ahead. This is the last one of these lectures. You'll be relieved, but I have really enjoyed doing this, and I thank you for coming. We got as far as the Depression and how Hampden-Sydney miraculously not only survived the Depression but made money. What we haven't talked about is World War II and the subsequent events. And unlike World War I, which everybody knew was coming and could prepare for, and we got a temporary ROTC program, and you would, from Hampden-Sydney College, you would hardly know any war was on. This time, what happened was, in the most literal sense, a bombshell. And everybody suddenly had to decide what they were going to do. In colleges, particularly all male colleges, had to make really fast decisions about what to do when they didn't have any students, because they weren't going to have any students real soon now. And there was a faculty meeting in January 1942, which is to say, while the smoke was still curling up from Pearl Harbor, which put the college on a 3-semester-a-year, 12-month basis until the war was over. This was not only to keep people from getting away during the summer, but in hopes of attracting some more by letting you get through in 3 years, okay? And the attendance dropped anyway in the faculty first, because there were, what you like to do is hire young faculty so you don't have to look for them again too soon, and so you can pay them, at the bottom of the pay scale. And so we had some young faculty, and they were, of course, all male, because women don't teach college. Henry knows that. Or they did at the time. And the result was that we had a number of faculty members drafted in the first 6 weeks of the war. And this was kind of okay, because as the number of faculty members went down, the number of students was also going down pretty good, okay? And there was considerable concern about this. But the president at the time was Edgar Gammon, who had been a Fort Leonard man in 3 sports while he was here, and had played football with the guys in the class in 1903, who was at this point a rear admiral in the Navy's, what amounted to their education department, training program, so on. And Gammon had also been on the football team with him at least 1 year, and so he called him and said, "Can you go to bat for us to get a Navy V-12 program," which was like ROTC, except that what they did was to take not your people, Hampden-Sydney students. They took people who had applied for the Navy who looked fairly bright, and they said, "You want to go to college on our nickel until we need you?" And everybody always said yes. And so the deal you got with the Navy was non-negotiable, and they would pay you $20 a month for your tuition for each student. And they would give you a number that they decided, and it was 250, as the maximum number of students they would provide, which, since 250 was about what our enrollment was, that was okay. They never did provide that many, but what they did was keep the number at 200. Then they would also pay flat out 100% of the board rate, the meals. And they would pay a strange percentage number based on the appraised value of your dormitory building for the dorm rent. But since the amount they were paying, the flat fee they were paying for tuition was twice what we were charged for tuition, we didn't complain about it, okay? The V12 program really did save us. And they sent, beginning in the summer of 1943, they sent 200 young men from any place who knew nothing about, well, some of them at least knew nothing about Hampden-Sydney, here to start or continue their undergraduate education. And since it was free, this was sort of the GI Bill, but before the war. The deal was that you could come here until you do poorly, in which case we were going to yank you and put you in the Navy as a seaman. Or if you do well, you can stay here until we need you. And we can't tell when that is now, but this is the Navy, and when we need trained people, we'll come and get you, and we'll tell you when you're going to leave college. But if you stay here at least a semester, then after the war's over, you got at least a semester of college out of the way and paid for them, huh? And so everybody said, oh yeah. And by the time the program left in the late fall of 1945, we had 670 V12 men here, and we didn't take many pictures of them, but this is everybody marching to assembly. The assembly was held in College Church because, remember, this is 1943, 44 somewhere, and the college own chapel, that is the McElwain Chapel, is too badly deteriorated and in too bad a condition to send anybody into it, and we're not using it anymore. And John's Auditorium, which in 1950 has not been built yet. So if you got a big meeting, meaning the Navy having a meeting of all the V12 people, you got to have it in College Church, and that's what they did. And you can certainly identify them from their natural markings. That's the Navy men. But basically, they saved the college. The faculty was worried about whether they were going to fit in academically. Are they going to be way stupider than Hampden-Sydney students, or are they going to be way better than Hampden-Sydney students? We don't know how to deal with this. And so at the end of the first semester, everybody wiped their brow because the grade curve for the V12 students was indistinguishable from the grade 12 for the modest number of civilian students who were still left. And so clearly this is going to work. And it did work. And after the war, all 673 people got sent a letter from Hampden-Sydney asking if they wanted to be on our alumni list, and over half of them did. So this worked out pretty well. There were a couple of interesting financial features to it. We had used raw influence to get a V12 unit sent here, okay? And so the Navy, the reason we didn't get it until 1943 is that in the meantime, the Navy was trying to figure out how to get us what sweet old Admiral George wanted. And they sent people down here, and we didn't have some physical facilities. We didn't have a swimming pool. And they said, that's it, we can't take you if you don't have a swimming pool. And Gammon got on the phone and got the unrestricted loan of Longwood swimming pool. Okay? And so they checked that off the list. But at the end of the list, there were still $35,000 worth of physical improvements that had to be done with Hampden-Sydney's money, except that FAST was important and will give you bonus refunds of money for getting this stuff in place fast. And Hampden-Sydney did it fast. And by the time the war was over, of the $35,000, all but 9,000 had been paid for by the taxpayer. So we got out pretty light. But the faculty was concerned as the war waned down, and it's pretty clear it's going to be over pretty soon now. What's going to happen to the enrollment when the V12 goes away, which in fact it did in the 1945-46 school year. And they were concerned about this, but by 1944, the GI Bill, which promised you a college education if you were a veteran, went through, and we were down to 20 civilian students by the time the war was over. But there were, until the last little while, there were 200 Navy men here, and then the Navy cut it down to 100, and so we were working with a total population of about 130, which was way too small, but on the other hand, we hardly had any faculty left. I mean, Graves Thompson, who did Latin, was also doing trigonometry, and Morris Allen, who did philosophy, was also doing physics. I mean, it was spread all over the place, and nobody was getting any money for this. They were teaching staggering overloads and not getting a nickel for it, but there we are. And they were really worried about what was going to happen when the V12 pulled out. And it turned out that when the war in Europe was over, which is spring 1945, a lot of people who had been in for the whole time got discharged and sent back, including a bunch of people who left Hampden-Sydney to go in the Army. And so now they can go back to Hampden-Sydney, and it is, ta-da, free. And so a lot of the civilian students we had lost in 1942 were back in the fall of 1945. So, and all right, thank you. We had what looked like a working number, but the college had expanded basically through the Depression to a steady 300 students a year. Can we get back to 300? We're starting with about 120 here, and we got some veterans coming back, but these are guys whose names I knew before they left, that kind of thing. Not sure what we can expect when everybody comes back all at once. And the answer was that everybody and their father wanted to go to Hampden-Sydney. Science was being taught in Bagby Hall, which had been built for 150 students. And we were running 300 through it, thank you, before that. And by the time I came here, we had 550 students in a 150 student building. And you can't do that. I'll get to that in a minute. But the number, there were 200 plus the civilians, which was kind of a little under 300 to only a little over 200 by the end of the war. And that was the number we learned how to work with. So we were already until the end of the war. But when it turns out that everybody who had a discharge ticket from the Army could go anywhere they wanted to college, a huge number of them wanted to go to Hampden-Sydney. And in no time, by 1948, we had 350, and it could have been 400, but there was literally no place to let them lie down. And we started thinking about having a 400 student college, which meant something. I don't know what, but we got to have more classroom space, and we got to have more dormitory space. And this went along with nobody quite doing anything until about 1956. And there were people running out the doors of Bagby. And fortunately, we had the new Morton Hall, and it was, by the standards we needed, it was big enough. But Bagby was the real problem. And by 1950, John's auditorium had been built, only that doesn't help you teach science. But there's no way you would know this now because it's been totally remodeled. But the T on the back of it was not there. It was just a rectangular auditorium, but it had a basement. The basement was paved with concrete, and it was one big room, nothing there. And about 1955, we got an aggressive young chemist in here who said, look, we can cut back on the squeeze in Bagby by moving the general chemistry out of the building. You let me have a modest amount of money to put lab desks in, and I will put in 2 general chem labs and a big general chem lecture room in that big concrete space. And he did. And this was G. Tyler Miller, and who became famous or infamous, depending on who you were, while he was here. But by the time I came, all the general chemistry classes met in the big classroom in the basement of John's, and the 2 labs were there. And there was a row of these little basement windows that are about a foot high. Roll those down each side of the thing. So you have some ventilation, but there were no hoods, of course. And so what Tyler did was get the college to buy him a cheap steel 20-inch window fan and set it on the windowsill. And anytime lab was going on, that fan was running. And this is okay, but the lab was really smelly, and not just smelly, but had a lot of acid fumes in it, which is why it really had to be ventilated. But it turned out that a year of acid fumes will almost completely dissolve a steel fan blade if the fan blade is going around doing this, wiping through fresh acid all the time. And the business office was very cranky about buying a new window fan when you've only had the old window fan 1 year. And I went through a couple of those fights. They never would believe it, but it really was true. But anyway, that got the general chem enrollment at that point was about 90, bigger than it is now. And we had to handle them in lecture and lab, and it all went on in the basement of John's, which was a good thing because all the space that got left behind in Bagby was being used up immediately. But still, it was clear that, in fact, in spite of the fact that Bagby had been, like a really good building when it was built, that we had a population problem. I mean, it's the wrong building. It's that it isn't near big enough. And so the college heaved a long sigh and said, well, we got to go to work on this. And so they spent the better part of a decade trying to raise money for a bigger, and this time we do really mean bigger, science building. And during the decade, there's one more funny episode that you won't read in any books anywhere about Hampden-Sydney that doesn't really involve Hampden-Sydney, but it does involve Hampden-Sydney people. Would you get me to the next? Yes, here we are. When the war was over, everybody's mood was a lot better than it had been. When you send somebody to college, you weren't worried about it being pulled off and sent off in the draft to be shot in Anzio, Italy. And if you were in college, you weren't worried about being drafted. I mean, it was a great time. And at that time, there was a young man who subsequently became a Hampden-Sydney biology professor, okay, which is how I know him and the reason you're getting this. But at the time, he was out of high school and was not afraid of being drafted, and he liked playing baseball, and this was fun. And if you would go to the next slide. Okay. What he did was to sign up for a minor league baseball team. He was from South Carolina, and North Carolina and South Carolina were the heart of minor league baseball at that point. It was the golden era for minor league baseball, and it only lasted from about 1946 to about 1955. 10 years and it was gone. But he was there at the key time. And I was living in North Carolina. North Carolina had, about the relative population you think, and it had 49 professional baseball teams. Okay? The league, I was in Goldsboro, which had a population of 20,000, one of the bigger towns in the league. And these leagues were all set up so that you could ride from, you didn't have any travel expenses except for gas, which was 20 cents a gallon, because every place you could possibly have to go to was within 50 miles. So you just wait until summertime and ride a bus over there and play the game at 7:30. Okay? And when the game's over at 9:30 to 10 o'clock, you get back on the bus and come home. And nobody ever goes to a hotel. And you're getting by for whatever, you're using school buses, which you've rented from the county. And yeah, this is low cost. Now you have to, if you're a small town with, say, 700 population, you got to raise money for a ballpark. And this is not the ballpark you look for. I tried to find an old one, and there aren't any pictures of old ones because nobody would take them. But what this does have is 2 lights in the outfield, and that's all the lighting you get. And the only reason this is there, and the only reason all these towns have a ballpark, is that General Electric developed floodlights that were powerful enough in the 1930s. And a couple of major league parks put them in. And major league team, well, the Cubs only played the daytime, but everybody else had some night games before World War II. After World War II, the Army had wanted so many floodlights for lighting military thingies that they made huge numbers and found out how to make it fairly cheap. And so after the war, they would be happy to sell you a floodlight that would light your baseball field for about $3. It was nothing. And so everybody said, hey, all we need is 2 telephone poles and we can put up a rack of these things on each pole and light it up. Well, you could, but it wasn't very bright, okay? Now, the other thing, if you notice the red circles there are only 2 umpires. Umpires cost money, and you can't just have one, but you can, by golly, get by with 2. And so all of these minor leagues had 2 umpires per game, one behind the plate and one in front of or behind second base. And the lights are not too good. So the guy who's doing second base is responsible for hanky-panky all around the diamond, and he can't necessarily see all of it, and besides, he has a much different directions he has to look at the same time. So you can get away with a lot of things there. So, okay, our faculty member, whose name is Ed Crawford, who became a feared biology faculty member because what he did was human biology, which is, of course, as the med school wanted to see on your transcript with a good grade to let you in. And he was tough, and the med schools in Virginia knew it. And so they would take his word he wrote good rec letters, and they would take his word for it. And if he approved you were in, that was it. So he was greatly feared by people who were here. And immediately after they got to med school and found out that they had great preparation for the med school anatomy and physiology courses, they liked him a lot. He had a big party when he retired. But anyway, at age 19 or whatever, he's the second baseman because he's a little wire guy. And he hits singles very well, but hardly anything. He can spray them around the outfield, but hardly ever anything longer than that, which means he spends a lot of time on first base. And the thing is that if you're in one of these leagues with 8 towns in it, then you only have 7 opponents, and you play them home and home. Our field tonight, your field tomorrow night. And this means that every 2 weeks, you come back, you run into the same team. And one of the other towns in the league Ed was in, had a first baseman who was way bigger than Ed, and who was also unscrupulous. Because whenever anybody on first base, it was kind of dark over there anyway. The guy would run 2 of his fingers up under the guy's belt and back, and it would look like he was just protecting first base. In fact, he was holding the guy's belt. If the next batter hit the ball, he would wait about half a second and then disengage his fingers. But this meant that whoever was going to get to second base was going to get half a second later than before, and he could reduce the RBI for the pitcher quite a bit that way. And you can imagine Ed didn't like this. So he thought of a way but he could never get the guy caught. It was too dark, and fingers are too little to see from second base, and I can't do that. So he thought of something. He took the belt out of his pants and took a singlet razor blade and cut about 3/4 of the way through the leather, here and here, okay? And the idea was that if the guy had 2 of his fingers under there and the man singled and you took off like a shot, and it was good at taking off like a shot, it would leave a foot of belt in the first baseman's hand, and he would finally be caught by the umpire. Fix that SOB. And so, okay, he had the belt fixed up this way. And they started the game, and Ed had not gotten on base by the 9th inning, and he was going to bat in the 9th inning. And he did get a single and went down there, and he felt the guy's fingers going in his belt again. And he waited for what would happen. And now at this point, they were a run behind, and it's the 9th inning, but the guy before him had singled. And so Ed represented the winning run, potentially. So he waited, poised, and sure enough, after 3 or 4 pitches, the next batter hit a screaming line drive into right center field, which had double written all over it. And, excuse me, Ed takes off instantly, and he feels the belt break. Okay. And he is now going at top speed down to second base. But he is young, and he has not done a full engineering analysis. The pants he has on are not his pants, but the team's pants. And they're issued to the 17th guy in line by the person who is issuing them from a pile, and they are whatever size you get. Furthermore, they've been washed hundreds of times, so they're as soft as toilet paper. His pants are too big and really, really soft. And when he's most of the way to second base, he feels them coming off. And sure enough, they drop off right at second base, but it is competitive. He was always very competitive. And he steps smoothly out of them and keeps on going, turns the corner heading for third base, and reflecting to himself that he should not plan on sliding into third. And he gets almost to third base thinking that he's done that pretty well, and he notices that the third base coach is doing this. So he turns the jets back on again, rounds third base, and heads for home, and he does not see the ball coming in, so that it looks like he's going to make it. But about halfway to home, the pants that were too big are the soulmates to his athletic supporter. which is also too big, and it had also been washed hundreds of times, and it fell off. But he's not going to quit now, so he stepped out of it and scored to wild applause. And the thing he said he didn't like about it was that the umpires were not looking anywhere near the first baseman with a fistful of belt. And so he never did get his revenge. But he did become famous, and he said, the rest of the time he was on the team, he was known as Tripod. So anyway, eventually you become very sober and just teach human anatomy and physiology courses. But it was, in retrospect, was kind of proud of that. Well, we aren't quite there yet. The college spent to some extent, the 50s, but certainly the 60s, fidgeting over how to get a science building big enough. And they ultimately got donors enough to pay for a third of it. And it was going to cost $4 million, and it took quite a long time to raise the rest of the money, but they did, and they paid it off. But it's Gilmer, and they started building at it in 1966. And Professor Mayo, who is sitting there, and I were basically the design team for this. So whatever's wrong with it is our fault. But we were told to build one, and you were not supposed to talk about this, but the capacity of the building in student terms, user terms, is 1,200. Now, we have never had 1,200 students. We've only had 1,100 one year for a little while, but that building was and is big enough. And there were good reasons for moving out of it, but they had nothing to do with overcrowding. And when it gets remodeled, it's still going to be a great big building and will be very nice. But anyway, that was that building and John's Auditorium and the library that got built next to John's Auditorium, where Brown Student Center is now, basically gets you to the end of the line. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, you know where John's Auditorium is, but next to that was something called Eggleston Library, because Eggleston had been president during the 30s. And it was built because we had overflowed out of what is now Brinkley, just the front end of Brinkley, which was too little to be a library, but it had been built for a library and it looked really nice. And as long as you don't have too many books or too many students, it looks pretty good, but it was too little. And we built a library and used it from 1962, I think, until whenever Brown got built, 2018, somewhere in there. And it was quite a good library. And if you think about what libraries are like, a library is just a giant empty warehouse that has lots of shelves in it, okay? And that's what a simple library is. And it was a simple library. So we had this building, and if you look at you're getting a very sideways view of it, but Eggleston Library was a nice big building, almost exactly the size of Brown Student Center. And it was empty in the middle because that's the way libraries are. Now, if what you want is a student center, either you want one bigger than that or smaller than that or one that size. And if you want one that size, the thing to do is remodel this, because you can remodel it real cheap. Okay, if you don't have to move any walls because it's all one big box with concrete floors, remodeling is cheap. We wanted one that size, and I know we did because Brown Student Center is exactly that size, and in fact looks almost exactly like that. If you think about it, it has columns on the front. That's a big difference. But we tore it down and built a new building. It has to have been cheaper. Go ahead.
Mold in the building. Berlin was just packed with mold.
Okay.
That's well toward.
Anyway, we built Brown on the exact site where Eggleston Library used to be. And of course, we didn't build Eggleston until Bart's library had been finished. So it worked out. But you can see where things were along there. Incidentally, the white building you can kind of see through the trees to the left of Eggleston, that's Thornton Place down here. That Gilmer did not exist when I took this picture. And of course, Bart's library didn't exist either. But next slide. Okay. Gilmer, you know what it looks like, but you've never seen it without shrubbery before. This is the first year it was open, and it looked nice and it functioned well, and I'm proud of it, and I propose to be vicariously proud of when we get through remodeling. And there's only one more slide, which is the front, also with no shrubbery. But anyway, that's the building you've seen lots of. And at this point, I have pretty much gotten you up to 1975, which is where I said we were going in that map the first day. And I want to commend you and thank you enormously for coming, because if you didn't come, I couldn't very well sit here and give these lectures. And this has been the most fun I've had in 6 years on the faculty. So I'm very happy that you came. And I won't say I can answer questions, but if you want to ask them, I'll try. But don't know. Hampden-Sydney, did I tell you how Hampden-Sydney lost all its historical records?
Fire. No.
Okay. In 1921, about 1918, we had a history professor who lived down here in a big Victorian house on the left side, and he was a bachelor. And the house was huge. And he announced that he wanted to write history at college. And the college had been desperate trying to get somebody to write a history for the better part of a century. And so they smothered him in kisses and said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Well, I need all of the historical records. And what I'm not going to damage them, but what I'm going to do is to stack them all up by year, 1775, 1776, so on, okay? But that'll help me write the book, but anyway. So they gave him everything but the board minutes. The board was a little cranky about this and didn't want their minutes to go out of their possession, which was a great idea, because they gave him everything else, all the financial records, all the alumni records, everything. And what he did in this big Victorian house was to walk around and make a pile next to the wall for 1775 and another pile for 1776. And he spent months getting everything in the right pile. And somewhere around 1918, he had a sudden heart attack and died. Oops. Now things are in a real mess, but we could put it back together by spending a bunch of staff time on it. But there's a big house that is not being used, and they had just hired the college's first financial manager, the first business manager, Mr. Atkinson, for whom Atkinson Hall is named, P.T. Atkinson, and his wife. They're both young, and they're told they can live in this big Victorian house, which seems like a great idea. So they walk down and walk through it, and it looks very nice, except that all of the rooms have this big rectangle of stacks of paper in them. And it's pretty much all the rooms in the house. And the stacks are very high. I mean, there's a lot of paper in there. And so they move in, and the first thing they do is hire a local person who has a 2-mule wagon. And they hire him to haul all of the papers out of the house, back behind the house about 200 yards and burn them. They don't recognize them because they'd never been here before. And so he spends an entire week going back and forth with a 2-mule wagon, hauling all of the college's historical documents back about 200 yards and burning all of them very efficiently. And so Brinkley's book is sort of stuffy if you try to read it. But the reason it's stuffy is that the poor sucker had to write the book with nothing but board minutes to go on. I feel sorry for him. But that's what happened to all of Hampden-Sydney's records. And anyway, that's why I probably can't answer your questions. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for coming. We're through, and I can't tell you how sorry I am that we're through. Go to it.